We're gonna be talking about reading. We know how to read and we love to do it and we do it all the time.
Can this be my intro to the video?
Hey pals, Editing Venti here again, just here to say that in case you are not in the know, this is part 2 of my January 2025 wrap-up. I'll link the first half in the description box below in case you somehow missed it. But basically this video is just covering the 5 books that I didn't cover in the previous one. I'm as yappy as ever, so let's just get right into it. Following that, I read a book called The Slummer, Quarters Till Death by Jeffrey Simpson. Oh boy. So this is the first book that my partner and I sort of co-read for our 2-person little book club, where basically we just read a book and discuss it together. This is one that his mom gave to him for Christmas because she heard it recommended for people who run and he's a runner. And I will preface this review by saying we did have fun with it, but not in the way that I think Mr. Simpson intended. And I'm really struggling to think of kind things to say about this because this is an independently published book and I try to provide at least some information about those books in particular because they are at a disadvantage when competing with the trad pub space. So I try to give some reasons and some audiences that I think would appreciate this book. But y'all, this one was just, it was hard to get through, and part of that was just because it was badly written on a prose level. The writing was quite repetitive, pretty wooden, and it relied a lot on using the sort of like finance bro sports metaphors rather than, I don't know, giving any indication as to a character's internality or explication about the physical action that's going on, which sort of is the point of a sports book. This is a sports book, by the way, sort of. Let me start from the beginning. This book follows our protagonist named Ben, who lives in the slums of Cleveland in a sort of semi-near future dystopian society that borrows very heavily from the film Gattaca. Basically, the wealthy get to genetically engineer their babies to be kind of perfect for whatever they want, whether that be sport or presumably other things, though we don't really hear about that besides runners who are genetically engineered to be really good runners. We don't really get any avenues to look at anything else. And the poors, the dirty poors, or the slummers, are relegated into ugly parts of cities that have tent cities where homeless people live. And it's just, if I'm doing a bad job of explaining this world, it is because my understanding of it, despite reading this entire book, is only as deep as what was presented to me, and what was presented to me was not very deep at all. Anyway, our protagonist Ben, who is a slummer and thus obviously not genetically engineered, loves to run. He's really good at it, and his big dream is to run professionally on a national scale, despite the fact that he would be up against elite genetically engineered runners, basically start to finish. But he's poor and doesn't have a coach and doesn't have food, and it's violent in these streets. Jesus. God, it's just so bad. The cards are stacked against him, and the story goes from there. And I say the story goes, and it's more that the story is something you need to push through from there, because there is not an element of this plot suffused with any degree of tension. At no point does Ben actively struggle. He just sort of grits his teeth and gets through things, and lo and behold, he has succeeded at getting through them. We don't even get to see him race a lot of the time. We just sort of have a scene break between him preparing for the race, and then the following paragraph begins with, of course, Ben crushed it. He's just not allowed to struggle. None of Ben's obsession with running gets in the way of any of his relationships with other characters, nor does his poverty play any sort of a role in terms of his ability to actually train. The main problem with The Slummer is that thematically it doesn't know what it wants to say, or it knows what it wants to say, but it lacks the capacity. Like, on one hand, it wants to do the Gattaca thing, and I know that this author loves Gattaca because so many of the scenes from the book are direct pulls from the movie, but it wants to do the Gattaca thing of no amount of being genetically engineered will beat somebody else's grit and determination. But then on the other hand, you have, and no amount of grit and determination can defeat somebody else having enough money to throw at whatever they want to do. Like, if you are economically disadvantaged, that will screw you. And in another author's hands, those two themes could be married really well, and this could be a story that's a tragedy rather than a piece of sports fiction, which generally leads to, oh my God, I'm so frustrated with this book, with the author's apparent lack of understanding of like genre. In order to make that latter theme shine, the protagonist needs to fail in important ways. In order to prove that economic disadvantage is a problem, our protagonist Ben needs to experience problems from it. And that is where Simpson just refuses to let that happen. There is nothing wrong with Ben. Ben is successful truly to an incredible and impossible degree. And I do think it's because he's a self-insert for the author. Like, I really think that Simpson took the writing advice, right, which you know, and just ran full steam ahead with it. Ben, runs 5Ks and he ran for Kent State, and he is from Cleveland, Ohio. And those are things all that are true about the author as well. The only difference is that Ben is like ethnically ambiguous and poor. And I think that Simpson is too close to Ben in those ways to allow him not only to fail, but to have flaws at all. Ben's only flaws are the sort of job interview ones where he's too passionate and he's too competitive and he's too driven at what he does. And that's boring and bad to read about in a story that, like sports fiction stories are supposed to do, are about the internal growth and the grit and determination of one character who, after being knocked down, gets the fuck back up again. That's what this story is supposed to be. And this book was nothing. It was just 300 plus wasted pages. Oh God. I think the only reason that either of us got through it is because we were reading it together. We had a road trip we were doing where I was reading it out loud. And so often we just had to stop and be like, wouldn't it be better if it was done this way? Or we just stopped to like have a laugh at the absurdity of what we just read. And oh my God, just what a nightmare. We're reading Model Home by River Solomon now, and that is going far better. But yeah, I will not be reading anything further from Mr. Simpson, and I do not recommend that you read it either. The book is just bad. I have a far more detailed review on my Storygraph, which I'll have linked below if you want to just see the snark come out properly and be coherent, because I'm truly just so suffused with rage that I can't be right now. Oh my God, just don't read it. Don't do it. Love yourself more than that. And that's, I think, the thesis of this review. The next thing that I read was Hoarded by the Dragon by Lillian Lark. This is the latest, I think, of her Monstrous Matches series. These books take place in a world where humans and magical creatures, so like witches, shifters of varying sorts, and like other monsters live on the world together. The humans don't know about the magical world really, but magical entities are relatively close-knit and have their own sort of like secondary society happening right under human noses. It's great. This book follows Katerina, a cat burglar turned art restorer who happens to be a witch, but she was raised in the human foster care system for a really long time after being abandoned by her parents. Because of this, the connections she's made in the magical world aren't always the most savory. So when a friend of hers asks her to come out of her life of crime retirement to do one last job to save his life, she agrees. What she doesn't know until it's a little too late is that the person that she was asked to steal from is Kalos, a dragon and one of the most powerful ancient magical beasts alive. Oopsie daisies. They end up having kind of a night of passion and she runs away, thinks that she'll probably never see this person again. She has the thing she needs for her friend until she starts having some really, really weird symptoms and she learns that she is pregnant with Kalos's child. Oops. Uh-oh. Did we know that this could happen? Not really. A witch and a dragon? What sort of a baby does that make? And it looks like this pregnancy is really dangerous for her unless she actively stays with the dragon himself, and feelings develop from there. My main gripe, and it was a pretty big one given that it is a romance book, is that I don't really love Kalos and Katerina together. In specific, I don't like Kalos for Rena. I think he kind of sucks. I think it took him far too long to get on board with having feelings for her, despite her sort of drawing a boundary of, I can't have sex without feelings getting in the way. He kept sort of pushing for a physical relationship between the two of them, while at the same time saying like, oh, I can't fall in love, for his own reasons. And instead of caring enough about her, even privately to himself, to stay away in any way that mattered, he sort of allowed her, after her feelings had grown for him, to exist in this sort of awful limbo state where she can't leave him because he is keeping her and the fetus alive, and she just has to exist in this sort of like, we are in a situationship and I'm literally having your baby existence. And it was rough to watch. Normally when there's an imbalance of feelings in a romance story, I like the groveling portion to happen not super early on, but like I like that person who believed that they had lesser feelings to sort of have it hit them about the 1/3 mark, and so that we get a good long grovel. I feel like Kalos's recognition happened far too long in the narrative for me to be able to root for him, and for far too late in the narrative to like make any sort of meaningful amends to Rena, who he hurt pretty terribly. I really appreciate the pair of them for having such frank discussions, not just about their feelings, but about their whole situations. I think that, especially given that there's a pregnancy the entire time of the book, that is really important. But I really wanted her to respect herself enough to tell him, no, I will not stay with you after this baby is born. You are not good for me and you are not kind to me, and I'm not going to subject myself to scraps of your affection just in the hopes that you'll begin to treat me well. But I really did enjoy the steamy scenes. I thought they were pretty hot. I enjoyed the way that this book expanded on the sort of lore of the world at large, and I am excited to see how that's going to have like implications in future books in the series, because this is sort of one of those companion novel serialized collections of stories, and I'm a huge sucker for things like that, especially in my romance reading. But I don't believe I will be returning to this installment, even if I would be returning to some of the others in the series, you know? After that, I reread Sam Sykes's Seven Blades in Black. This is the first in the Grave of Empires trilogy. I've decided that 2025 is going to be my year of finishing series, particularly series that I already own and enjoy, and I really enjoyed Seven Blades when I first read it, but I did need a refresher before continuing on with the story. So I picked it up last month, and I am so thrilled to say that I loved it just as much the second time around. This book follows Sal the Cacophony, a vagrant in the Land of the Scar. This is a borderland region that is constantly under threat from two factions, one being the ultra-mechanized but ultimately mortal Revolution, and the other side being the Empire, an empire built of magic users of varying walks who have to sacrifice things to have their powers basically work. When we meet Sal, she is in a revolutionary barrack being questioned as to the location of Ketherick Proud, a low sergeant from their army. And as part of her questioning, Sal begins to tell us her story. She starts off talking about a murder that she has very recently committed and crossed a name off of a list that she carries in her pocket at all times. She commits this murder by using a magical gun called the Cacophony. The weapon is incredibly powerful, and Sal is completely ruthless. But as Sal is going on to try to find more names to cross off from this little list of hers, she realizes that several of these characters are embroiled into a plot that would do a tremendous amount of damage to the entire world. Now, is Sal going to save the world out of the goodness of her heart? Absolutely not. That is not the type of woman she is. But will she foil this plan to get at several of the people that she is trying to get revenge on and kill them dead? Absolutely. If she saves the world as a sort of symptom of that, so much the better. And alongside her brilliant artificer, off again, on again girlfriend Liette, and the aforementioned low sergeant Ketherick Proud, who truly is the do-gooderiest of all do-gooders, Sal goes off on this journey to foil this plot, and the story goes from there. I think the absolute strength of Seven Blades in Black, and I hope going forward in the other books as well, is Sal's narrative voice. She does a lot of self-mythologizing, because truly the story as we're reading it is kind of being told retroactively as she is sort of being questioned within this barracks. And you can really tell that through the narrative. It sounds like somebody is telling a story and that they are a really good storyteller. Like, you really are sort of hooked and waiting for her to say what's happening next. And we get these scenes interspersed throughout where we jump out of the narrative of the story and we hop back into like the present timeline where Sal is being interrogated, and her interrogator is also feeling like, okay, so like what happens next? Like what's going on now? And it's in those moments, I think, where we still get like Sal, the like shit-eating grin, like little badass that she is, but we also get a very like human and vulnerable version of herself, which we get in the main narrative as well. But when it's not her mythologizing herself, I feel like it's even more vulnerable, given especially that she is slated to be executed after this interrogation happens. That vulnerability reads as more true and honest. And much like the interrogator, I, even though it was my second time reading it, was also just eagerly turning pages because I wanted to hear more of the story. It's just really well told. I like the slow reveal of information about not just the political unrest in the Scar and beyond, but also the reveal of sort of the history of how it got to be this way. It feels very like Western flintlock fantasy a little bit in terms of like the trappings of the setting, but in a very distinctly unique way. And it was really interesting because we're in Sal's head. It's very much a Sal-centric story. It was good to see also glimpses of who she was and how she was a part of that history and making it happen. At no point could you say that Sal is the moral center of this story. Far and away, that honor goes to Ketherick Proud, my love, my light, my darling. But she is not so terrible to deserve some of the things that are done to her and that have happened to her. And it was like heartbreaking to see her make decisions that pushed away people that really truly cared deeply about her. But at the same time, it was tremendously satisfying to watch her follow her arc, which feels like the arc of a tragedy. Like, it feels very Hamlet, the way that Sal behaves throughout this narrative. And I don't think that Seven Blades gets the flowers it deserves. I can only hope, of course, that the rest of the series sort of lives up to sort of the quality of the writing and the quality of the character work of this story. And if it's not, then I'll understand. But I feel like the fantasy girlies got to get on this, and not just the girlies, all of them. Yeah, we're done actually using book girlies. I feel like that's an unnecessarily gendered term, and I'm not gonna be part of that anymore. But the fantasy readers ought to get on that. No, it's not steamy romantasy, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's a good book. You should be reading this book because it's a good book. Thematically, it's really cool and important and well done, and the world building is great, and the character work is great, and the romance that we do get is also great, even if it hurts a little bit. I'm begging y'all to read something that is emotionally complicated, and Seven Blades is a really good stepping stone, I think, into that sort of thing. Regardless, I will be following Sal to the ends of the earth. If book 2 is even a fraction as good as this one, I will be racing to the conclusion of this story as soon as possible. Like, first quarter of 2025, hold me to it. I will have completed this series, and then I'll probably never recover. God, my hopes are so high. I don't want to be setting myself up for failure in that way. Fingers crossed, I will never recover. Following that, I finally read Britney Spears' memoir, The Woman in Me. I think given the state of the world and certain fears that many AFAB people are having right now about their bodily autonomy and etc., reading a story about a woman in the public eye who had her bodily and emotional autonomy ripped from her in a really big way, it makes sense that I was gravitating toward this kind of book, I think, at the time. And I found it to be incredibly well written. I think that A Woman in Me was a really heartfelt and insightful look into one of the most scrutinized public figures probably of all time. I'm really thrilled that we live in a world where Britney Spears can speak for herself finally again, and that she can without fear talk about the ways that she was abused, not just by adult men over-sexualizing her, but by her father placing her under a medical conservatorship, and also by the world at large with the deeply misogynistic, toxic, and invasive media sort of landscape that she was coming up in when no one in their right minds could survive that sort of a thing. The 90s and the aughts were a wild time, and let's be very clear, the 2010s and the 2020s are not much better. Of course, any memoir is going to be biased in favor of the person writing it, but I feel like Britney did a pretty solid job of explaining situations in which she was wrong in the way that she has grown from that time. But honestly, given the tremendous length of time under which she was completely silenced and the absolute charisma with which she recounts her stories, even the ones of her more bad and silly behavior, made me forgive her. Not that my forgiveness has any bearing on it, I just think it was an absolute delight to read this book. Spears is a natural entertainer. I think it came through in this book. I think whoever her ghostwriter was, I'll have their name somewhere on the screen because they deserve to be credited if their name is public. And that natural, like, entertainer's charisma came through in prose as much as it does in her songs and when she dances. I hope that if she doesn't want to, Britney Spears never tours again. I hope she never writes another song again if she doesn't want to, and if it's not something that brings her joy. And I really believe that she is the best person to decide for herself if and when she will come back into sort of the public sphere more intensely. And if she does, I know she'll be an absolute whirlwind because she's just that kind of girl. And the final thing that I read in January was Watermoon by Samantha Soto Yambao. This was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and I'm happy to say that it did not disappoint. Watermoon follows Hana, who has just inherited her father's pawn shop, but this isn't a regular pawn shop. Rather, it's one that exists in a pocket dimension where people from our world go to trade away their regrets and their choices. But on her first day on duty, Hana wakes up, realizes that her father is gone missing, and so has one of the pawned regrets. Before she can address this in any meaningful way, in walks in Kay, a man from our world who has found the pawn shop the way that people do. And for a variety of circumstances, the two of them have to work together to retrieve this missing wish and find Hana's father before Hana is forced to suffer a pretty cruel fate at the hands of those who own the regrets, the pawned regrets, after they have been given to the shop. Watermoon's prose is absolutely beautiful. It is, again, not purple, but it is lovely and artistic, and it very much flows the story forward in a way that keeps you turning pages and gets you to the end of the book before you are ready to be done with it. I found myself absolutely swept up into this world and into Hana and Kay's points of view. Hana, being the very much insider of this world, is very matter-of-fact when she talks about fantastical elements that Kay is experiencing for the first time, whereas when we are in his eyes, it is very much through the tremendous wonder of seeing something that somebody believed was impossible. Kay happens to be a scientist, so he especially is fascinated by how the things in this world work, and is hopeful that he can bring some of the more wonderful aspects of Hana's world back into his own, where they could do the maximum amount of good for us regular mortals. I think both Hana and Kei's perspectives were really fun to read in, not just because of the differing insider-outsider dynamics that each of them brought to the framing of the story when we got to be in their heads, but also because they were quite similar in terms of their pragmatism, and the way that pragmatism never really killed the hope within them, even for Hana, who, because of the world that she exists in and the cultures that she was raised in, shouldn't really be able to have hope because she believes that fate rules every step of her life. I also really enjoyed their mirrored arcs. I feel like there was a tremendous degree of mommy issues in both of these characters in ways that brought them closer together. And I say that in a very flippant way. In the story, it is far more poignant, but I only have so long that I can take for this review to be. But also both of them experiencing this idea of like feeling at the whim of fate versus having the ability to make choices, and sort of approaching that from two pretty much opposite points of view was really satisfying to watch them each come to the conclusion of that arc and choose to remain together and care for one another the way that they do. I didn't really buy their romance at first. I felt that it happened way too quickly, the way that they were drawn to one another. Though given what we find out about both Kei and Hana at the end of the story, I think it makes sense that they are drawn to each other the way that they are. And as the story went on, I did start to root for them. It was just at the beginning where I think that that relationship was a little too just jarringly intense. I think because everything else flowed so organically, having something that was so jarring made it stand out even more. And for some readers, that might really work, simply because Kei is an interruption into Hannah's preordained, fated lifestyle, and so it would make sense that that relationship had that sort of an effect. For me, though, personally, it didn't quite feel earned enough to have its place in that narrative. I think the parts of Watermoon that will stay most with me is the way that it made me feel, and that is generally the marker of how well I enjoyed a story, is how much I feel about it afterwards. From jump, I was wondering about how I would feel if I were one of the clients of the pawn shop, and if there is any element of my life, any choice that I regret bad enough. And I think the conclusion that I came to is that there isn't one, and I'm glad that that sort of conclusion that I came to was rewarded by the narrative ultimately. But other than that, it was just an overwhelming sense of whimsy and joy, and just a style of storytelling that's just so lovely. If you've ever seen the show on Netflix, I think it's called Midnight Diner, I think I would recommend this book to fans of shows like that, where there are a lot of like little like sort of serialized stories, but they all kind of come together at the end. The author did a fantastic job of wrapping up every loose end and sort of closing it off at the end. I think it was just beautifully done. I would recommend it basically universally, and I think it was a wonderful way to wrap up my reading for the month. And from there, I have been continuing Reading Up a Storm throughout February, and I intend to get on with it now. So that brings me to the end of my January wrap up. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave it a thumbs up. And if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to my channel. I post videos on Thursdays, and I would love to have you join my little bookish family. Comment down below if you've read any of the books I've mentioned here, and let me know what you thought of them, or if leaving a comment is just a little bit too much. I totally get it. Go ahead and leave me a crescent moon emoji to let me know you've made it through the end of the video. But regardless, that really is it for me. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you with the next video very, very soon. Goodbye.
So this is your setup?
This is my setup right now, yeah.
Rate my setup.
Bad.
Reading very nice.
Very nice reading.